even officially today, we've got 47,000 people who've died as a result of COVID, and that's the highest in Europe. The real figures, if you look at the gap between the number of people who normally die at this time of year and the number that have died this year, it's quite a lot more than that. It's up close to 70,000 now. So the root cause of why the government's in a mess is because they've handled the crisis so badly and so many people have lost their lives as a result. Why? The bottom line is because their starting position was to do nothing. That's the traditional position of probably capitalist classes around the world, but certainly British capitalism. The 1918 pandemic, they did nothing. There was an epidemic in 1957, they did nothing. And at the start, they thought they could get away with the same thing this time. Dominic Cummings, the government advisor who's creating the mess at the moment, he's the one who has said early on that the government's policy was herd immunity, protect the economy, and if that means some pensioners die, too bad. And that was their real position. Just let the virus rip. But as they saw that hundreds of thousands of people would have died and other countries around Europe were shutting down, they belatedly had to go into lockdown. But by that stage, the virus was everywhere in the community. And so the lockdown was really too late to have the effect it should have had in terms of stopping the virus. Why were they so late to act? It is partly the character of this government. So, the Tory party is arguably the most successful capitalist party on the planet. It's a very long-standing capitalist party, the major party of British capitalism. But this Tory party is not the old Tory party. After 10 years in office, carrying out brutal austerity, the Tories were extremely unpopular and split and divided amongst themselves. And it is a bit like Trump. Johnson got elected almost against his own party as standing up for the little people, he claimed. The man who was going to get Brexit done. So he's a right-wing populist, really, leading the Tory party. But the Tory party remains extremely split, and he is not under the control of the capitalist class, as was shown by how slow they were to lock down, and is also shown by the whole Dominic Cummings craziness. I mean, it really is crazy. This is an unelected advisor to the Prime Minister. It is a Rasputin character. He has no elected position whatsoever. They belatedly lock down, tell everybody they've got to stay at home, and the population does. People have obeyed the lockdown rules. It then comes out that this unelected advisor travelled when his family and himself had COVID to the other end of the country, infecting who knows on the way. And Johnson doesn't just back him to the hilt and keep him in office. Tony Blair's advisor, Alistair Campbell, once famously said, once the advisor becomes the story, you've got to resign. Clearly, Cummings had to go. But instead, yesterday, he had an hours-long personal press conference in the Rose Garden, which is like the government sort of, place where they make big announcements, to justify his actions to the population. And people are furious because they've stayed at home. People have not gone and visited their dying relatives in hospital. People, have not visited their closest relatives. They've been stuck at home, ill themselves, with ill children. And now this man, they justify him having broken all of the lockdown regulations introduced. I mean, it's incredible. So they've made a complete hash of it. And of course, their ability to deal with the virus it doesn't just come from the mess they've made in this crisis, it's all the decades of neoliberalism that came before. Britain had the lowest number of intensive care beds in Europe. The care homes, as in many countries, have all been privatised. And the way they stopped the NHS being overwhelmed was to send people without having been tested back into the care homes. It was compared by one right-wing newspaper in Britain, the Daily Telegraph, as being like the siege of Kaffa, which apparently was 1346, when a Mongol army threw dead soldiers who had the plague over the walls into a city to infect and kill the city. That's what they did with the care homes. They sent people back they knew had COVID to the most vulnerable populations, and they've died in huge numbers as a result. But the privatisation and the running down of the care homes has happened over decades under right-wing Labour and Tory governments, etc., etc. And of course then the poverty of the last 10 years, what austerity has meant, has also worsened the effects of the crisis. The borough I live in London, Newham, has had more deaths than any other borough in the country, and that's because it also has the most overcrowding, the most workers working in low paid conditions with no proper health and safety and so on. So everything that went before prepared it for this being a mess, and then the government's actions have made it even worse, and they are now hated for what they have done. And we're heading into this gigantic, as Tony mentioned at the end, economic crisis. There are now more than 2 million people who've applied for unemployment benefits, but in addition to that, there are 7.5 million people who are furloughed. So 80% of their wages are being paid by the government at this point in time, and that is meant to be coming to an end or beginning to come to an end at the end of July. But once the government starts cutting that back, even more millions of people are going to be facing unemployment. The Bank of England has said this is going to be the worst economic crisis for 300 years. So it's a huge mess, and Johnson may have been elected with a big majority 6 months ago, but it's looking less and less likely that he can survive this.
Well, I mean, it's incredible. So we've had the prospects of a 300-year recession, or the worst recession for 300 years. A different composition of the Tory party, as Hannah has said, and we've seen today how it's got even worse for the government, with Michael Gove, another minister, admitting that he went on a 60-mile car drive to test his eyes to see if they were okay in one of his interviews. But you have that crisis, Hannah, as you've explained, but what's been the reaction of the working class?
It's moved quite quickly, actually. This is a weird time in history, because on the one hand, everybody, or a lot of people, are locked down at home, so things seem to be moving slowly, but actually consciousness has changed fast. Because at the beginning, once they decided to lock down, the government went on this huge propaganda offensive. Everybody's got to get behind Johnson. We've got to have it was a bit like the start of a war. National unity to stop the virus. It's disloyal to criticise him. And that had an effect at the beginning. People were kind of not supporting what the government was doing, but thinking this isn't the time to criticise, we need to shut up at the moment and so on. And that was added to enormously, because unfortunately the big majority of the trade union leaders completely went along with that. Even left union leaders making remarks like that they were parking their members' demands until after the crisis. Everything had to be put aside for the crisis. And also the leadership of the Labour Party at the start of this crisis, Jeremy Corbyn, the left leader, was still the leader of the Labour Party. But even then, they did not clearly criticise the government. They got pulled along with this national unity mood. But then once the new Labour leader was elected, Keir Starmer, who the capitalist class are much, much happier with, then he openly said that he would be prepared to join a national unity government with the Tories. 2 weeks ago, he was still saying that the government had done a wonderful job handling the crisis. I mean, it's just incredible. So because there was no opposition at the top, that has an effect in society and amongst the working class. But so does people's experience. And there's been a big change taken place. Primarily, it's struggle over issues relating to health and safety of those workers who are still in the workplace all the way through, or those that are now being pushed into going back into the workplace. But we've seen very important and successes won by workers, postal workers, for example, bus drivers, and you're going to hear from Mo about the struggle of the bus drivers, the battle of workers on London Underground, but also coming up now are the teachers. So the government has decreed, clearly for reasons of childcare, to get workers back into work, that the youngest children of all, the ones least capable of social distancing, should be the first to go back to school. And they're meant to be going back on the 1st of June. But there's been a huge movement of teachers against it. 20,000 teachers attended a national online Zoom meeting to discuss refusing to go back on the 1st of June. And the teachers' union has had to take, under that pressure, quite a firm position that there should be no going back until it's safe. So actually, workers have tested their strength a bit in saying they're not prepared to work unless it's safe. And that has also posed who decides, who controls the workplaces, with elements of workers' control developing in the course of this struggle. And then that combined with the kind of general effect that we've been told for decades the working class don't represent anything, they're not important, that if you do low-paid work, you're a meaningless person. And then it turns out, who keeps society running in a crisis? It's the working class, including the lowest paid sections of the working class. And they know that. So there's also a kind of general increase in class confidence, I think.
So we've got an increase of class confidence. You mentioned there, Hannah, how the trade union leaders have not been prepared to offer any serious resistance to what Johnson and the government have been doing. So maybe Mo, you could outline an important issue here, because of course we have different frontline workers in the health service, the cleaners, all of the care workers, the workers in the supermarkets, but also the transport workers, because they've kept the transport system running. And of course we know for a fact it resulted on London transport a horrific number of tragedies, with bus drivers dying as a result of contracting the virus. Now, they kept the buses going, but what happened, Mo, and how did the bus workers react to this position?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Hannah. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Unfortunately, sadly, we've lost far too many, one too many bus workers in London and across the country as well. Transport workers dying. Majority in London buses are bus drivers. When we first had the initial lockdown, this was just 2 weeks before the lockdown kicked in. We were campaigning on scheduling and work-life balances of drivers being forced to work long, excessive hours. And this has been going on in London buses for a very long time. And we were prepared to, we've done a consultative ballot, which overwhelmingly supported strike action. And then the lockdown came on, which we had to postpone our organizing for industrial action. But this was, the workers were coming together. And when we had
I think we've got a sound problem there, Mo. Actually, no, it's okay. Carry on.
Yeah. When we had the lockdown, we were told that this virus is around, but we won't explain properly what this virus was about. And then we had to figure out ourselves how we're gonna protect ourselves. Are you guys okay to hear me, or is there a microphone problem? Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Oh no, we got you back now. Just now we
Right.
lost you a bit. Sorry.
Right. So just going back to where I was. So when we had this lockdown, we were trying to figure out how we're going to be defending ourselves. We weren't getting much leadership, obviously, from the company as usual. And what we were doing was we started to think about how we're going to defend ourselves from this virus. We didn't at the time know that how many bus drivers were affected by the virus. Until we started to realize that we, from hearing from other workers, we realized that we have to, clean our hands. There was no soaps around, there was no sanitizers, there was no masks, there was no social distancing markings in the premises, and we started to demand these from our employers, and we were not getting any of these stuffs. But we knew that we spent most of the time in the bus cabs, and we knew that the disease was passing through from people, from colleagues, and so forth. So what we decided was we tried to implement our own safety measures, which was sealing off the assault screens. We were sealing off the nearest seats to the bus cabs. We were informing passengers that please stay away from the cabs. And a lot of these colleagues of mine that were doing these things, like, they felt that obviously at the time, some drivers who are not prepared to stand up to the bosses were doing something that they'll get into trouble for. So obviously my colleagues were sharing these on social media and looking at whether what they were doing was okay to stand up to the bosses. And then other drivers saying, well, I'm doing that as well. And that's where the confidence led on, and everyone started to seal off the assault screens where the speaker hole were. We were sealing off the nearest seats to the buses, and that was part of building the confidence. Eventually, some drivers took some further steps, such as closing off the front doors themselves, and we had management put up notices saying you will face disciplinary action if you close off the front doors yourself. But drivers didn't care less, and carried on doing these, taking their own control while driving the buses. Eventually, all these actions that we took were endorsed by Transport for London. Now the front doors were closed off. We had perspex screens fitted on. We had our bus cabs being cleaned off. But these took so long. We had to do it ourselves, and we had to highlight the problems. But all these problems that we had about buses not being cleaned, toilets not being cleaned, these were pre-existing problems before COVID-19. Many of the members of public didn't know about this. Many of the people generally didn't know how bus drivers were being treated as. But now, general public understand that bus drivers are treated like crap, like, they're treated without respect. They're denied their rights. And we had a lot of, we have managed to get public support in this, which is one of the reasons why Transport for London couldn't ignore us. We've had lots of drivers go out on social media. We've had drivers, explain to people this is the situation and seek out for help. And unfortunately, at some occasions, we didn't have the leadership from political leaders, Khan, at that time, that we had to demand from a Labour mayor. We had to demand and ask him to implement a few things. He said, okay, we will trial the front doors operation being closed off. And these things a Labour mayor should be saying, well, do whatever is necessary, a Labour mayor should be saying, to protect yourself. This is the leadership I was expecting from a mayor that calls himself a son of a bus driver, which we didn't get that. And obviously a lot of bus drivers are now saying that they won't vote for him. And obviously they'll be looking for an alternative next year that will stand by the bus workers. It's exposed his political program has not been in the interest of working people. It's shown that he hasn't even called out for nationalisation, public ownership of the buses at any point. There was a bailout on the buses, we welcome it, but however, he hasn't mentioned or he hasn't demanded that the buses can only be operating in the hearts of the working people and general public if it was publicly owned. The only reason why the buses, the conditions of the workers are deteriorated over the years is because we are working under private for-profit employers whose only interests have been to make profits, not improve the standards of the workers, not improve the workers' welfare conditions, not make sure there's a toilet at the end of the stand, not ensure those soaps were provided. Those things have now been exposed. And now workers are thinking, how can we protect ourselves further and secure our future on the buses? How can we get out of this battle and get out of this through a battle? Not fight for it later on, but fight now and secure proper terms and conditions. We know that Khan will be going out and asking for more money, but he shouldn't just go out for just asking for more money or a grant. He should be demanding that if any of these bus companies don't fulfill the workers' demands, such as safety measures, then those operators should be stripped off their contracts and put in public ownership. Those are the demands that he should be putting on. He's not once said those bus contracts to be stripped off and put it back under Transport for London, at least. None of these were mentioned. And this is Khan and his politics, and this is what he's had. He's had the Tories attack him, even the media outlets attacking him, because and that's because he's been sucking up to the Tories, which he shouldn't have. If he had been fighting for the cuts when George Osborne removed the funding from Transport for London in 2015, and if he had organised and worked with the trade unions, all transport unions, if he had done that in 2015 and built up a base and built up the grand mood of the workers and fighting the cuts, because what he did was he implemented the routes being cut in London that put an impact on jobs, that put an impact on passengers who are not able to find a bus in London, and they had to wait longer for buses, and that did not certainly improve the economy when these cuts were implemented. He allowed the Tories to implement those cuts, and we say we fight the cuts and we demand nationalisation of the buses. But in this pandemic, we should be demanding proper pay, proper terms and conditions. We shouldn't be shy of asking for more money for working extra long hours and during this pandemic. If the bosses can't pay, then we should be saying public ownership. We can't say, well, apologise on behalf of the Tories and say, well, they haven't got no money. Well, they do have money. They're not gonna throw it out without a fight. We have to fight, and I'm sure if the union leaders encourage and talk to all the union representatives, organise more meetings through Zooms, organise safety committees, and we say that we're not going to be prepared to lose any more bus drivers in London, any more bus workers, no more fatalities, and we put demands through now, we will be able to push forward for public ownership with workers' democratic control, because it's exposed. Those operators need to be slammed. We've got bus operators who have highest mortality rates. In one bus depot, we know there's 5 deaths. Nobody's even highlighted those. We've not even have any data of how many drivers are in a coma, how many drivers are today in a ventilator. Those statistics are being hidden, and the mayor and some of our union leaders can ask for those information and expose those operators, find out what the root of the problems are. We know that the mayor recently announced that there will be a study from University College of London. We welcome this, but we can't put our reliance on universities. We are hearing that there will be inquiry later on the buses. We can't put our reliance. We welcome the inquiries, but we can't put our reliance on a judge. And are we going to say that we're going to rely on a judge? Recently in December, we had a judge obstruct the working people, the Royal Mail. They said they denied them for taking action. Are we going to put our reliance on a judge to decide whether the operators were behaving good or bad? We know we've suffered for so long. We know what these operators are about. They're not in the interest. Their only interest is profits. We have bus drivers dying. We've had one bus driver die, and you know what? One of the bus drivers, the drivers wanted to give tribute to this driver. One of these bus operators denied the cortege to pass through the depots for us to give tribute. This is the way these operators treat the bus drivers. They're ruthless. They are not in the interest of the workers, and we must organise. And I believe the bus workers are one of the most important transport workers, do a fantastic job. We must be recognised, but we can only be recognised if we organise. We are one of the most powerful trade union. We can be potentially we can be one of the most powerful trade unions, advancing working conditions across the country. And we can also demonstrate that we have the ability, but we can't afford not to fight right now. Thank you.
No, that's fantastic, Mo. You gave a graphic illustration of what's happened, and also it raised important questions there. One, that it was the workers themselves that changed the working conditions to get safety measures taken, not the Labour mayor. And I think you graphically drawn out there what role he has played in general as a so-called Labour mayor, and as he's rightly said, who boasts a lot in his propaganda that he's the son of a bus driver. It's amazing. But nevertheless, you know, we have this perspective for economic catastrophe unfolding, and that undoubtedly is going to result in a tsunami of unemployment developing. amongst which the youth are going to be some of the hardest hit. And we have here today Theo Sharieff, who could maybe touch upon some of the issues of what are the prospects for young people now in this crisis, particularly in relation to the youth unemployment. So Theo,
tax that they've come under since the last crash in 2007, 2008, is the boss's attempt to make young people, but the working class as a whole, pay for the economic crisis which is now unfolding. And like you said, Tony, the chief threat really for young people being the prospect of mass youth unemployment, which has massive potential to develop very rapidly. Now, young workers have already actually been some of the worst to suffer because of the lockdown, because it's been the consumer-facing sectors which have been hit the hardest, as you'd expect under the lockdown. Things like restaurants, pubs, the hospitality sector as a whole. And actually only, I think it was on Friday last week, it was announced that 30,000 pubs and restaurants are expected to just not reopen when the lockdown is eventually in the future lifted. That's hundreds of thousands of jobs which are now threatened in that sector. And that's a sector which young people overwhelmingly look towards for a chance at getting a job. And that very concerning announcement was preceded by actually a report earlier in the week by the Resolution Foundation, which predicted and is predicting now that youth unemployment could swell by 600,000 and could even hit as high as 1 million on the dole by the end of the year. And that means that youth unemployment will leap up to the 1 million figure by the end of the year at a much faster rate than it did after the 2007 crash. It took 4 years for youth unemployment to peak at that in 2012. What this report by the Resolution Foundation's also warned of is what it calls the scarring effect on young people's futures. And essentially what that means is the more long-term effects. So one example I'd give, it predicts that in 3 years' time, employment rates for mid and low-skilled workers entering work now during the crisis risk falling by 27 and 37% respectively. And for graduates who are entering the labour market now from universities, it will be a 13% collapse. And by the way, this isn't just, of course, a process happening in Britain. This is going to be globally. That, young people are facing austerity, attacks and unemployment. And we stand in solidarity with all young people globally fighting and who will be fighting against this situation. But back to Britain, it's obvious then that this isn't going to be a temporary blip of youth unemployment and then it will drop back down. But this is going to be something a bit more long-term than that and on a bigger scale than 2007, 2008. And the Tories, I think the Tories are nervous because of the explosion of anger this could create from young people. And there is a searching amongst the Tories as well and their friends in the media for what the solution to this impending crisis is. And what's absolutely clear and couldn't be clearer is that the Tories don't have any solutions to these problems which are facing young people. Various analysts and experts are suggesting that the Tories should be introducing new training and apprenticeship schemes given access to young people. But what have Tory training schemes and apprenticeship schemes meant in the past? It's meant workfare, work for your dole, work for your poverty. It's meant apprenticeship schemes on £3.50, £4 an hour, which don't even guarantee a job at the end of them. So we have to make these points, but also look at what's going to happen. You'll have 800,000 people leaving school, college and university this year. Do we really trust the Tories and their system of capitalism, which has just been plunged into an economic crisis to deliver all of those young people a future? I don't think we can trust it to provide young people with a future. And we can't put any trust in a system which says that 1 million young people on the unemployment scrap heap is an inevitability to provide us with any sort of decent future. So I think we have to fight tooth and nail to any attempts to make young people pay for this crisis, but also we need to fight for a different kind of society, I think, which puts the futures of young people ahead of the profits of big business, which of course for us means fighting, as we'll explain and here in this meeting, means fighting for a socialist transformation of society.
Now, I mean, one of the other aspects of youth, you mentioned there the question of young workers and how they're going to be affected, but obviously in the education system, I mean, all the indicators point to the fact there's got a massive crisis opening up in the university sector. with the loss of income from foreign students, with the cutbacks that are taking place. They're looking at cutting back in lecturers' posts. And what's happening with the students at this particular stage, and how are they reacting to it?
Well, I think what's guaranteed is going to be massive struggle amongst students and on the campuses as well by campus workers, because you're right, the whole university system in Britain has been plunged into crisis, and we have to say this is a crisis of the Tories' own making, because it's the direct result of their efforts over the last decade to push further and further the policies of marketisation in the higher education system. And from their point of view, just to explain to some of our international viewers, from their point of view, the crowning achievement of that was when they trebled tuition fees about a decade ago, which means that to attend university now in Britain, students have to pay £9,250 a year. But importantly, government funding to universities has been drastically cut, meaning that universities rely on that tuition in order to exist. So that itself plunged, thousands, if not millions, of students into a lifetime's worth of debt. But international students from outside of Britain, actually pay twice, if not three times more that rate for their tuition, which means that with the coronavirus crisis and expectedly the slowdown of students internationally applying to attend British universities this year, it's plunged the universities into a funding crisis. It's mind-boggling, really. They estimate about £2.5 billion pounds has been wiped from the budgets of the universities, and it's called into question the entire future of the sector. Like you said, swinging cuts on campus opposed. The UCU, the union which organises workers in that sector, estimates that 30,000 jobs are threatened at the moment. But also, meanwhile, students are being asked to carry on paying that full rate of tuition fees for online tuition. So not even for face-to-face courses or the chance to attend lessons on campuses. That itself could provoke widespread anger. But the matter, like you say, the matter of universities going bust altogether isn't out of the question. So this crisis will mean the bosses in the universities trying to make campus workers, students pay for that crisis. And we demand, in short, that not a single cut or job loss or closure is made on any of the university campuses because of this crisis. And we say marketisation, it's very, very clearly exposed now, has led hundreds of universities to the brink of collapse. And we demand that the market model is scrapped entirely. And what that means is that fees should be scrapped, student debt should be written off, and student loans should be replaced with living grants. But also all outsourcing and marketisation should be reversed in the sector. The higher education should be taken into public ownership, publicly and fully funded.
So you've dealt there, Theo, with the question of young workers. We've heard about what's going to develop in relation to the students. What has the Socialist Party youth wing and youth activists been able to do in this crisis, and what plans are there for intervening in these impending struggles by young people?
Well, we plan to intervene wherever the struggles of students, young workers, we're going to be there intervening. And our bottom line is we don't accept that any of this is inevitable, not mass youth unemployment, not cuts to education, not any kind of sacrifice to our future, if young people get organised and fight. And that's why the Socialist Party is going to, next week, is going to be launching our new youth charter, a fighting programme for young people on all of these questions, the bottom line of which is that we refuse to pay for this crisis with our futures, and that it should be the rich who are made to pay for the crisis. And we ask in that charter, our starting point is, what do young people need? Well, we need access to well-paid jobs and decent jobs. We need access to training, skills and education. But the question is, on what basis can we win such a programme, and what kind of society can provide us with that kind of future? And although we're discussing today the fight for our futures, let's not forget the past. Let's not forget what the past 10 years have meant for young people. What have we faced? Poverty pay, an explosion of 0 hours contracts, unaffordable housing, and an absolute annihilation of youth and public services, as well as cuts to education. Now, all of that wasn't accidental. That was the result of the last crash, when the Tories and big business made young people and working class people pay for that crisis. But we're a generation who's known nothing but cuts and attacks on the basis of capitalism. Now we've faced further and even more vicious attacks. But although capitalism as a system cannot provide us with a future, we still say that the wealth and resources do exist in society to provide all young people and working class people with a decent future. But the question is who controls and who owns those resources, either the big business bosses, as is the case under the system of capitalism, or the overwhelming majority in society, which is means working class and young people. So as our starting point, we fight to take the 125 biggest banks and monopolies into democratic public ownership, and that would make it possible to plan the economy to meet society's needs. And we say that means young people and workers, workers could make the decisions about what we need, democratically direct the resources in society to where they need to be. So for a program of investment in job creation, and by the way, that could include a mass program of works and jobs created in green technology and renewable energy, but also for fully funded education and to share out the work in society to provide everyone with a decent job. That's the future. That's the socialist future we fight for. But I'll just finish on this point. So I think what Mo demonstrated in his last excellent contribution is the power that working class people have when they get organised, how much working class people can win when they're organised and in a trade union. So a key step for all of this for us has to mean young people getting organised. Crucial to that is joining a trade union, but not just joining a trade union, fighting for your trade union to take the collective action necessary, starting in your workplace, to fight to defend our health and safety and jobs, but students as well. In the schools, in the colleges, and in the universities, we need fighting democratic students' unions in order to organise the struggle. So I'll leave my comments there. Wherever young people are going to be entering into struggle, we want to be there to help them get organised and to organise around a fighting and bold programme to ensure our futures.
Now, what you and Mo and everybody's really indicated is there's obviously a phenomenal crisis opening up. The question is, what's the alternative? Now, maybe Hannah could have some thoughts on that. We've seen a change in the leadership of the Labour Party. Hannah mentioned earlier Keir Starmer's response during this crisis. But a lot of people had a lot of hopes in Corbynism, that it was possible to change the party. Is this the end of Corbynism? Is it the route for, is it the end of a route for Labour being transformed into a fighting organisation? And if so, what is the Socialist Party putting forward? Hannah.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, obviously this is a crucial issue for workers in Britain. Keir Starmer, the new leader of the Labour Party, is actually up in the opinion polls now. Not massively, but he's beating Johnson, at least in some polls. But honestly, given the complete incompetence and mess that's being made by this government, it's not exactly a huge achievement. But it reflects the fact he has started to kind of criticise the government a bit too softly. But the question is, in whose interests is he criticising the government? And really, he's doing it on behalf of a section of the capitalist class who don't agree with Johnson's approach to the crisis. You want proof that he's not doing it on behalf of the working class? Interview after interview. In one interview, I heard him asked 3 times, would you support workers who refuse to work because their lives are being endangered by going to work because of the lack of health and safety? He would not answer because he didn't want to give an inch to the idea that workers should take action to defend their health and safety. The day after he was elected, the Financial Times, so where the capitalist class talked to each other a bit, they had an editorial where they urged Starmer not to join a national government, because that was the talk at the time, and Starmer had said he was willing. But the reason they give is because while Boris Johnson still maintains support in a national emergency, much of it will be shallow and short-lived. And really what they were getting at is that Starmer should keep his hands clean because this government could be forced out of office. And despite its parliamentary majority, that could be right in short order. And they wanted Starmer to come in ready to act on behalf of the capitalist class. It also helps that they're very worried, and an additional reason, they're worried by Johnson appearing to say that he's going to go ahead with Brexit on the agreed timetable, no matter what, no deal, which the capitalist class are also worried about, and they know Starmer would take a better position. But the main reason is they fear movements of the working class. And it can't be ruled out. But a Starmer-led government would wreck the shell that is left of the Labour Party, because like PASOK in Greece in the last crisis, it would do the bidding of the capitalist class in a terrible capitalist crisis. But how can it have come to this? This is the point that Tony was referring to. Given the huge enthusiasm there was for Jeremy Corbyn, he was thrust into the leadership of the Labour Party. In a way, it was almost accidentally, because you could pay £3 to become a Labour Party supporter and vote in the leadership election, and this left figure was on the ballot paper, and people flooded in to do it. And that was potentially a big step forward. And in the Socialist Party, every step of the way, we've pointed how Corbyn could consolidate his victory. But unfortunately, it was never consolidated. The approach was always one of trying to reach unity with the right wing, with the pro-capitalist wing of the Labour Party, and making compromises in order to do that. And that meant that gradually Corbyn supporters have been demoralised. It's the inevitable consequence, but also the mass of the working class haven't heard Jeremy Corbyn's anti-austerity message clearly. The last general election, the Brexit policy, which had a big part in Labour losing that election, was set by Keir Starmer. It was his policy, but Corbyn adopted it and then took the blame for it. Around the country, Labour councils have implemented austerity. Mo referred to this. And Corbyn didn't criticise them, which, undermined his anti-austerity measure. And they didn't fight to transform the Labour Party. It remained a pro-capitalist party in the sense of the people who dominated the structures, who dominated the Parliamentary Labour Party, who dominated the council chambers. And then there was this influx, which was a potential workers' party, but had to be harnessed to fight to transform Labour, and instead was told at every stage, step back, be calm, it's going to take time, don't go too far. And the result was the defeat of Corbynism. What has taken place is the defeat of the Corbyn movement. But the working class needs a party more than ever in this crisis. It needs a mass party that's going to represent its interests. And there are still, I know quite a lot of them in my local area, there are still good lefts in the Labour Party who are fighting to transform Labour, and good luck to them. But they're going to face a choice, because when the next elections come up, which is in over a year's time, if they get anti-austerity candidates selected in their local areas, great. But if they have pro-capitalist candidates elected or imposed, are they going to call for a vote for them just because they've got a Labour rosette against the background of mass youth unemployment, incredible economic crisis? They will need instead to say, no, we're going to back real anti-austerity candidates. And what we're saying now is that the trade union movement urgently needs to start to discuss how it can have its own political voice. The road to that is not through the Labour Party at this stage. Starmer's been able to walk back in to a party whose structures are pretty much unchanged. So a discussion has to begin on how we are going to achieve it, in which the left union leaders in particular have a responsibility to start taking action. And in those discussions, the Socialist Party will be arguing the case for a new mass party of the working class.
Well, so there we have it. We have a very clear position of a deepening crisis here in Britain. We've heard what the Socialist Party thinks of that and what the members of the Socialist Party are putting forward. And of course, we encourage all of our viewers to visit our website at socialistworld.net, where they can find more analysis and comment of events that are taking place around the world. You can follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialists. You can like our page on Facebook at Socialist World-CWI. You can follow us on Instagram at Socialist World, and all of our streams are now available live to watch on our YouTube channel, CWI Media. So we'd like to finish this broadcast with a further appeal though. Don't just sit on the sidelines. If you like what you've heard from the CWI, then join us. If you're in the UK at this stage, join the Socialist Party. If you're outside the UK, visit our webpage and contact us, and we'll put you in contact with our comrades struggling around the world to build a genuine socialist alternative. But we'd also like to make a further appeal. We need to strengthen our resources. We want to improve and develop our media output in the course of the next period, which is going to play such a crucial role. And that costs money. We don't get backers, rich backers. We rely on the donations and support from ordinary working people and young people. So we'd appeal for your financial help. We need it more than The Guardian does. We need it more than some of the other media outlets do. So we'd appeal to you to go onto our webpage at socialistworld.net and make a donation. And don't just make a donation, but join us in the struggle for a socialist alternative. So we thank you again for watching. We'll be back next Tuesday with further comment and analysis of another aspect of this crisis. In the meantime, stay safe, keep struggling, and let's march forward to build a socialist alternative.